Welcome to the Religious Studies Project. My name is Christopher Cotter, and I'm here with
David Robertson.
We are brought to you in association with the British Association for the Study of Religions, and today's podcast was recorded at the IAHR, so the International Association for the History of Religions, and it's David speaking with Tomoko Masuzawa on the invention of the secular university, which sounds fascinating. I'm really looking forward to this.
The Religious Studies Project, as an academic endeavour studying religion, we are, of course, devoutly secular. In fact, we tend to take the connection between the academy and the seculars completely for granted. But was this always the case? To discuss that today, we're joined by Tomoko Masuzawa, who is Professor of History and Comparative Literature at the University of Michigan. So first of all, thank you for visiting the Religious Studies Project. Maybe we can start the conversation then. When we talk about the secular university, what kind of secularity are we talking about?
I think it is actually, rather than secular university, I planning to entitle this book as the academic secular. Mm-hmm. And that is because it's in a way the way to dodge that question, which is too difficult. Or rather, you will have to read the whole book to give an answer to it. I think it's precisely because the meaning of the secular itself, as you might imagine, has certain history. Yeah. And the one we are really most familiar with is very recent. And perhaps it is different even in the same English-speaking countries, United States and UK. One should not presume that it's always we mean what the same thing is. Yes. And so, in a sense, my project is trying to, instead of our tendency to project our quarrels back into our earlier times, and as if that notion of the secular is always identifiable in the earlier times, just try to actually see how our sense of the university, or science for that matter, is something that is distinct from religion, piety. Mm-hmm. So to put it another way, how is university is a very different kind of institution from church. Yeah. Right. So this is a project to try to really sort of see that coming of the distinction. Not that they were simply merged together, as I think that's one of the things that complicates it. Yeah. It's not that there was university was always indistinguishable from church or anything like that. But nonetheless, that relation is not what we presume it is, right? Mm-hmm. So that is really is the project. Mm-hmm. And so, in a sense, we think of not just the university as an institution, research, science, science in the broader sense, not just the natural science, but the Wissenschaft. Mm-hmm. So how do we come to understand those endeavors as quite distinct, and somehow institution has to be separated, and therefore making the presence of religion, how does one understand today the presence of religion within the university, right? Mm-hmm. Even though this project isn't really about religious studies. Yes. But nonetheless, you might say that's one way in which religion is present. Mm-hmm. And we might feel that, yes, precisely in a secular university, religion should be present in that sense. Mm-hmm. In other words, as a subject that can be an object of serious scientific investigation. Absolutely, right?
Yeah. And I have some questions about that, because I do think it's very relevant to, how the discipline of religious studies is constructed as, this academic endeavor in itself. Mm-hmm. But we'll come to that towards the end. Mm-hmm. I want to move next then to the idea of the university or academia, the academy. We're talking about something that goes back to like the medieval period, aren't we?
Well, certainly. And, in fact, it might say that, there was always science. As long as, human beings are sort of, we understand the sort of, as we know it, right?
Yeah.
As long as we have written history, we do have the sense that there is a learning. That there is always an institution insofar as they're human society.
Yeah.
So, depending on how you define it, you can say that it is really as old as human history.
Yeah.
But, what's unique about institution of university as we know it is, of course, it is the very specific high Middle Ages. Right? So 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, critical beginning time. And it begins in Europe. And now that we have it everywhere in the world, but nonetheless, how is it, this institution that begins? And to me, in a way, it's interesting that it's a very successful institution.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody had to evangelize on behalf of the university. It spread everywhere. And yet it's one of the things that is so European in its origin. I put it in that quotation mark, why it starts at certain time in Europe. As you may have looked at it in my précis and introduction, it's because of the influence of something else, right? So in a way, I see the rising of Europe and rising of the university as very much connected. So I thought that was another sort of interesting moment to focus on, that we learn a lot about.
Indeed. If I'm understanding you right, then there's an interesting parallel with the kind of world religions, the invention of world religions in your earlier work, that both cases we get quintessentially European ideas, but they emerge from an encounter with the other.
Right.
They're almost a reaction, and there's an interesting parallel there.
And in fact, it's almost, I almost hesitate to say that there's an encounter with the other, precisely in the case of university. I think Europe as an identity comes into being at that time.
I see, right, yeah.
I mean, we project Europe as before the 9th, 10th, and 11th century, but from what I understand, it doesn't really look like anything like we all imagine as the European, right?
Indeed.
I mean, the Mediterranean world was itself a world. And then, of course, as of the High Middle Ages and later, it is Europe, as we know it today, that claims that Mediterranean past. But that's really is a legacy that is claimed rather than natural growth.
Of course, yeah.
So I think university as an institution really epitomized that move. And I'm not criticizing.
No.
It is the institutional history of universities in many ways. I think it's a making of Europe.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Then later, I mean, these kind of medieval universities seem to have been largely, groups of people who were interested in learning, kind of getting together. I mean, that's maybe a bit of a casual way of putting it, but essentially.
Yes, it is in some way, if we use our own terms, it was a very democratic institution, you might say. It is the voluntary gathering of people, and it was a guild, right? So that's, I think, it's important. So even though they say, university was founded, medieval universities were not founded. And so it was a voluntary gathering of people. And I think that's 19th century historians began to realize that. It was to the credit of 19th century historians, particularly reform-minded people who discovered that history. that it wasn't simply Pope decided or
Yeah,
Emperor
right.
decided to institute this university as an institution, but rather it really had to do with a gathering of the people.
Right. Because, of course, we don't have, at this point, you don't have the institutionalization of the different roles. And, so
Right.
actually that kind of hierarchical organization wouldn't have been possible. Really.
Well, actually, some universities began as a guild of masters, that is to say, professors.
Yeah.
That would be Paris, whereas Bologna, which is another model, and that was very much a students' guild.
Right.
So,
I see. Okay.
you see people who are coming and paying fees, and whether university started as a more or less weight on that side, or the masters who are interested in making sure the quality control,
I see, right?
So how to issue a diploma, and also what are the rights and privileges of that diploma.
Indeed, yeah.
Means. So Paris is very much of the masters guild, whereas Bologna was the students' guild.
I see.
So there are different patterns.
That's interesting, right?
But of course, the assumption was that those students eventually are going to be masters,
yes,
right?
Yes, right.
But then they carry their diploma or license so that they can take that diploma to elsewhere.
I see.
So that's that idea of degrees. Yeah,
it's quite early.
It comes from that period.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Then there's this kind of transformation later on where we get the idea of the collegiate system comes in, and that kind of transforms the role of the university.
Right. And that is, of course, particularly relevant to the people who live in the western part of, particularly England, and then also to a large extent the United States,
right? Because
it wasn't university that was transplanted to the New World, but rather it was colleges.
Yes, yeah.
So that development of colleges, of course, it's a complicated story, but the most the salient aspect to the question of secularity and religious university and so on is that it was the college that really could impose the religious control.
Right.
Because they are essentially private corporations.
They're private,
right?
Yeah.
And so that the so-called confessionalization of the university. In other words, it is the Reformation and thereafter that some of the universities, at least, become very, in a way, religiously restrictive institutions.
Yes.
And certainly the epitome of that is Cambridge and Oxford.
Yeah.
And that's why they become, in a way, the focus of British reform movements in the 19th century. So it was everything to do with the fact that it was closed to anybody but the Church of England members.
Right, yeah.
And then also the fact that those colleges were enormously wealthy.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, which isn't the case in other parts of Europe, other universities, and or Scottish universities. I think.
Well, I might have something to say about that later on, but we'll come back to that. I want to leave the controversial questions to the end. Okay. Well, it's sometimes said, Tim Fitzgerald said it before, that the notion of religion itself is kind of a Western idea, which, we then exported out to the colonies. Can we really say the same about the university then? It's, the spread of the university around the world is kind of coterminous with the spread of Westernism, if you like.
Certainly. And then I think the receiving part, understood that very much. But, it might, certainly in the case of Japan, I can say with certainty, and many other places in Asia, I think, it's German universities.
Yes, right, yes.
And they never look to Oxford or Cambridge,
Right, yeah.
or Harvard or Princeton.
Okay.
That's not the model. It is
see,
Berlin through and through. And it is in many ways retained that character, certainly in the case of Japan.
So, and tell us a little bit about Berlin. This is the early 19th century.
Yes, 1810. And it was established in Prussia, at that time, Brandenburg, Prussia. Yeah. And this is really the reason why the newly established German universities were in some ways opening up towards different kind of understanding of what university is. A number of reasons. But one of which I think is a background, I think it is a very interesting one, is that Brandenburg, Prussia, in particular, was religiously mixed to begin with.
Yeah.
That is, the ruling family, Hohenzollern, from the 17th century onward, they were Calvinists. So they had what the Germans call the Second Reformation. Right? They became first, after kicking and screaming, changed from Catholicism to Lutheranism. And yet it was just too close, so that in a way they became more adamantly evangelical. And so the ruling class became Calvinists. And yet they could not take most of the population, including, of course, many powerful aristocratic families. So over the years, over the centuries, in fact, that they had this kind of a double structure. They had an interest in not emphasizing this whole question of what is the right Christianity. Right. Because the result would be war. And they've done that. And so, in a way, when they established the university, new university, they had interest not to emphasize the question of the right religion for this university. Right. And interesting thing that happened, of course, is in the case of Berlin in particular, was of course it had theology, faculty of theology, and it happened to be led by the first dean of the faculty was Schleiermacher, who, of course, and he wasn't the only one, but he symbolizes this new understanding of what theology is as a Wissenschaft. In other words, it's not in competition to other kinds of Wissenschaft, but it is itself as a Wissenschaft.
Indeed.
So, in some ways, the theology faculty, it certainly is not satisfied with simply the training of the ministers, but rather it's a science that would, of course, benefit the training of better clergy, and yet this kind of new understanding of what it means to study religion, if you will, in our language, was there from the very beginning. And so, of course, in the case of adaptation in other parts of the world, they just said, oh, well, that's for Christians. We don't have churches, or we don't have enough of them to worry about. That we don't have a need to satisfy that end. So they just simply said, okay, we'll just have law faculty, medical faculty, arts and science faculty, and many times in the case of Japan, for example, they thought political economy is a good substitute, as it were, right? So economics and what we call economics and political science became a kind of stand-in for theology. So I think there are all kinds of reasons why the Berlin model was interesting, and at the same time it was adaptable in many ways.
Of course, the right religion in this context really means the right kind of Christianity, right?
Yes.
And this is a fascinating aspect of this, because it's the idea of the secular university emerges actually from religious infighting or competition. This is the really interesting thing.
Right. No, I think you got it right completely. That's what I did not really plan to argue this point.
Yeah.
But what the material began to tell me.
Yeah. These 19th century theological disputes, really. Right.
And which does not at all make the question of secularity any more suspect. As a result, that certainly is not my point. But rather, it's just to understand, under what circumstances these questions come. Right? Why does university have to be secular? At the beginning of this whole process, they weren't talking that way. But then towards the end of the century, you look at it and say, well, the secular science, or if they don't use that word, at least arts and science is completely separate from theology or divinity.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a really interesting thing, because in religious studies, which kind of emerges in the post-war period, we're so often concerned that theology and religious studies, not be conflated, because, we're the science and they're not. We're the thing that's secular and they're not. But in these early universities that you're describing, theology itself wasn't even a distinct discipline. It emerges in this post-Berlin model of the university, which is...
Yes, in a way. I think, again, the term theology itself is, you could trace that. And you might say that, yes, the 12th and 13th century, precisely at the time when the university emerges, theology itself kind of comes into being. And which is, of course, very different from what Schleiermacher did.
Yes, of course.
But so in a way, all these sort of multiple strands of potent terms that are very important to us today, for the people who are interested in the study of religion.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And I'd like to sort of ask you a couple of questions about that then, because it's really actually made me rethink a few of the questions and assumptions. So there are a lot of chairs in the supposedly secular university that we know are being funded by various religious bodies today. And this seems to be, the problems there in the UK and the US, although the situation's a little bit different. In the US, it does seem to be that people are very concerned with Christian theology kind of creeping in by the back door, and certain funding bodies, for instance, with perhaps a religious agenda. In the UK, it's slightly different. We've got a lot of, certainly, most of the religious studies departments, for instance, are embedded in departments which were theological for hundreds of years. And there are certainly, for instance, at the University of Edinburgh, sorry to name and shame my own department, but, there are chairs there which are funded by the Church of Scotland, for instance. We have chairs elsewhere that are funded by Islamic bodies, for instance, and I'm sure that there are other examples. So this muddies the picture somewhat of our supposedly secular study of religion, or a supposedly secular academic work, full stop. And what would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I think that's a particularly British and American problem.
Okay.
Because, you look at Germany or Netherlands, or for that matter, many of the Japanese universities. They are national universities.
Okay.
And so this whole idea of endowed chair, it's very peculiarly, not that they don't exist elsewhere, because they are private institutions, but the most kind of high profile, if you will, universities in Germany or those places in the continental Europe, as well as in Japan, are national institutions, right? And so the professors are the state employees, technically. And so this endowed chair is, I think, is a very American and British
So this is kind of a direct legacy then of the collegiate system.
I think, well, it's not exactly collegiate, but rather the privately funded chairs.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Privately funded aspects within a supposedly state institution, right? Yeah.
Right. And of course, in America nowadays, it's in every religious group,
right?
You know, and there's always a controversy each of them. But it's important to recognize there's this peculiar the legacies,
right,
you know, and it's very interesting that how the British universities also kind of adopted that, even though the founding of the institutions are quite different.
Yes.
I'd say Edinburgh isn't the same as Harvard, and yet
the same problems.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but I think I don't really particularly address that in the book itself, but I do know what you mean. It's I think it has been a growing problem in a way.
Right, and that leads me into the last question then. And we're supposedly entering this kind of post-secular period, and religion is, I'm doing square quotes for the listeners, is reappearing kind of in public life, in increasing amounts. I mean, in different ways in different places, but it seems to be kind of across the board. So what, and the university as well, what do you think is going to be the impact of this on study of religion particularly, but other studies as well, where religious voices are perhaps going to be, if not more influential, certainly louder.
I wondered, what do you think is the way in which religion is, as you put it, reappear, right? What do you think are the ways in which religions have become more visible, or?
I think the prominence of, as we kind of already mentioned, of obviously religious people doing scholarship that clearly has a religionist agenda, for instance.
Okay.
Not that there always haven't been those people, but it seems to be increasingly the case. The media in particular is focused very heavily on religious identity. It was, if you look back to the 70s or the 80s, for instance, it's certainly in Britain, I'm not so clear on, elsewhere, it was ethnic was the identifier of the other, was all done on ethnic. Now it's increasingly religious. And I mean, there's obvious reasons for that, but it's interesting.
Okay.
I think the most problematic one for me is in public life. That, British leaders and US leaders are much more willing to state the religious ideas behind their actions, which was something which was,
or presume behind other people's actions.
Indeed. Yes. And that was something that was not on the table for a long, long time and has reappeared quite dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years.
Yes. No, I agree that is the case. And, so all the more, many of us who are much older than you are, we started, focusing on religion as a subject of our scholarship in a time when it seemed almost quaint.
Yeah,
because we are dealing with either dying species or, or something that should be dying. And whereas suddenly social scientists, so in other words, religion wasn't particularly respectable or interesting subject unless you have your own problems that have something to do with it, right? So there is always a presumption that if you are studying religion, you must have some quirky interest, investment in this.
Okay.
And then I think for people like me who didn't have those, it seemed particularly difficult to. So, whereas right now it seems like everybody wants to talk about religion, even though they don't have much sort of history to their understanding of what religion is.
Indeed.
And so on. So, all the more I think right now the religious studies as a discipline, as a group of people who have really focused very strongly on the history, not only of this or that particular religion, but rather our understanding of what religion is,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so has more of a role, right? Because it's not, we know, for anybody, we should know that that religion is simply not a kind of a natural phenomenon that we find, but rather, in many ways, complicated historical construction, construction that is not fiction, but rather it's a reality molding, very powerful sets of ideas and so on. So rather than this or that religion forming a particular mindset, causing them to do certain things, but rather that very understanding of what religion is something that we all, as sort of a historical subject, has participated all through.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So I think to me, what's most exciting about being in the religious studies field today is that you get to do, you have sort of read a more sort of immediate, if not access, at least you know where to go to address that question, right? Rather than just saying, okay, what does Islam say? Indeed. What do they believe? Indeed. And then what causes them to act this way?
Exactly.
We know that that is a very problematic construction question to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. Who else but us who could really, with some credibility, be able to say that?
Yeah, indeed.
So I see that religious studies, not just simply by, as it were, giving information about these different cultural forms, which is important. Of course, it has to be done, but not just that, but simply to have a certain kind of a self-critical understanding of our history, discursive history.
Indeed. Yeah. And I want to thank you for sharing an actually very interesting and not well covered aspect of our own disciplinary history and our role as academics in our history. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that there, David.
And thanks to the IAHR for the amount of help and facilitating our sometimes unusual requests at the last minute.
Absolutely. The notion of the university as a sort of secular space is obviously particularly pertinent to the study of religion, and came up quite a lot in your panel at the IAHR on conspiracism. I thought there was a lot of conversation in that panel about it.
But hopefully, having heard that interview, then the reason that the university is perceived as necessarily secular today isn't exactly what you thought it was.
Exactly. So, on the topic of conferences then, so we've just been mentioning the IAHR, and next week's another interview from the IAHR that I recorded with Brent Plate on religion and film, which, is quite a fun interview, so I hope that goes down well. But we've had a number of conference reports that have come out recently on the RSP website, thanks to Tommy Coleman. And we've started to be approached by quite a few conferences now about getting RSP representation, maybe, recording some podcasts, roundtables, covering the conference in some way. And that's something that we're more than happy to countenance.
Indeed, as we mentioned last week, we're heading down to up. I'm not quite sure. We're told
it depends.
It'll be up, yes. Yeah. To the AAR conference later this month with the assistance of the NAASR. To record some interviews at the conference there. We've been approached by a couple of other British universities next year to come and do similar things there. So, as Chris was saying, if this is something that you would like to add to your conference, you'd like the RSP to come down, publish a report, do some interviews, perhaps a roundtable, please get in touch. All you really have to do is cover our expenses, and we're happy to do it. And it's a great box to be able to tick on your public outreach aspect of your, wherever your money is coming from.
Exactly, because as we say, every one of these podcasts. At the moment, in the first week, I think they're getting about 800 downloads in the first week.
And that's up a lot on last year.
And, if you're publishing even a conference report in a journal or any sort of journal article, if you're getting that level of readership, you'd probably be tenure immediately for getting that. I'm just pontificating here. Yeah, we're just bigging ourselves out. We're into this is advertising, man. It's a harsh world out there.
Yeah,
we've got to try.
But really serious.
So come back. Think about that, first of all, for your conferences, and come back next week to hear me chatting with Brent Plate.
Yeah. What's the subject, Chris?
Religion and film. So, of course, it's another one of these...
the ands
that we... that are useful clickbait to have in titles for podcasts,
Indeed.
But that we don't like. And I immediately kick off the interview asking, what on earth does that and mean? Is it in film, on film, relationship to films as religion, etc.?
Get the clicks, then deconstruct.
Exactly.
It's a great strategy. And if that's a strategy you like, come back next week. If you want to find out more about that strategy, then go to our Facebook page, our Google Plus page. You can follow us on Twitter. You can get our podcasts on iTunes, where we really appreciate a rating if you could be bothered. Do use our Amazon links if you're in the UK, in Canada, or the US. They help us out a great deal at no expense to yourself. But other than that, we'd like to say,
thanks for listening.